Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Greece is in the midst of an economic depression. More than a quarter of its working-age citizens are unemployed, and half of Greece's workers 24 and younger are out of work. Household incomes have been declining every year since 2008. And just as in Europe during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the dramatic drop in living standards has shaken up politics. Late last month, the far-leftist party Syriza won a stunning election victory by promising to renegotiate the country's huge debts and end crippling government budget cuts imposed by Greece's lenders. Germany and other mostly European creditors that lent the country tens of billions of euros are so far having none of it. Greece's new prime minister, Alexis Tsipras, and his finance minister are arguing that the budget cuts imposed by the foreign lenders have destroyed Greece's economy and made paying the debt impossible. The disagreement leaves Greece in a game of chicken with Germany and other European governments. If Greece defaults, it could force the country out of the Eurozone, dealing a heavy blow to the common currency. If Germany and other lenders forgive some of Greece's loans, other heavily indebted European governments like Italy and Spain likely will also want better deals of their own. Can the Syriza government lead Greece out of this crisis? We're joined today from London by Maria Margaronis, Europe correspondent and contributing editor at The Nation. From New York, by Natassa Romanou, a founder of the New York chapter of Syriza. And from Washington, D.C., by Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Welcome to Global Journalist, all of you. Jacob Kirkegaard, could you just walk us back a few years and explain to our listeners, how did Greece get so heavily in debt, and how is it that we've come to this crisis right now?
Well, I think as with all really big crises, there is a lot of blame to go around. Greece was a country that for many years had relatively high debt. It then entered the euro area in 2001, which meant that it had the ability, or certainly the government had the ability, to borrow even more at lower interest rates. So it did so. So there is that element, and obviously when you're also in a common currency, you do not have the ability to have your exchange rate depreciate and thereby, in a crisis, get out of trouble, so to speak. But it's also clear that Greece was a country that for many years suffered from a corrupt political elite, a two-party system. It suffered from oligarchic big business interests that were sheltered by the government. So there is that element. But then I think there is a third element as well, that it is a country that for many years has suffered from mass tax evasion, a completely unsustainable pension system. So there are many issues that really came to a head in 2009 when the then government announced that the budget deficit was not 3%, but 15%, which meant that all international creditors essentially lost faith in the accounting or the government of Greece, and therefore refused to lend Greece any more money, at which point the international lenders stepped in. They then designed an international rescue program for Greece, the so-called Troika program, which was clearly not designed for the situation that Greece actually found itself in, which was not a national crisis, but a regional crisis in the euro area as a whole, which meant that the fiscal cutbacks, etc., were quite likely excessive, which all contributed to the very, very dramatic decline in economic growth we have seen in Greece since 2009.
And Maria Margaronis, you were in Greece during the election. You've reported on Greece extensively. What's the mood of the people there now? What does the austerity, the government budget cuts, how does that play out in people's lives?
Well, I would say the mood has changed quite dramatically since the election, and we can talk about that. But in terms of the austerity, it's really been catastrophic. It's hard to describe how much people's lives have changed, going all the way up into the middle class. Not only have many people lost their jobs, workers in the public sector have had severe pay cuts, sometimes up to half their pay. A lot of people are working without being paid, both in the public and private sector. And the psychological effects of this have also been devastating. We've seen a massive increase in suicides, a massive increase in family breakdown, in depression, in mental health issues, in homelessness. And what used to feel like a functioning European society has really come close to disintegration. So many people before the election were saying that they were so ready for a change, that they were prepared to take the risk of leaving the Eurozone because things could just not go on as they were. And that was partly about the austerity measures and the cuts and so on, which were have not just been budget cuts to the government budget, but also mandatory changes imposed from outside to things like employment law, minimum wage, things of that kind. So there's been a tremendous loss of sovereignty and self-determination involved in this crisis as well. But so what I was hearing from people in Athens was, well, we just can't go on like this. And whatever happens next, it can't be any worse. The feeling was that people are standing on the edge of a cliff and something had to give. So there has been a dramatic change in mood, I think, in Athens since the election. And, you know, seeing yesterday huge demonstrations in Syntagma for the government, after all the protests we'd seen against the government over the last 5 years with riot police and tear gas and stones thrown and so on, to see this enormous peaceful demonstration gives you a sense of how defiant people are feeling, which is not to say that many, many people are not also extremely worried about what's going to happen next, or what may happen next.
Natassa Romanou, you've been a member of Syriza since the early 1990s. Syriza was a very small party back then. It was winning 3-4% at elections. Now it's the sensation in Europe. Why has it been so successful? Why now?
Yeah, I think that Syriza was always a left party that stuck to its principles and was criticizing the rest of the ruling elites in Greece, the two-party system, the PASOK and the New Democracy, which have interchanged in governance for the last 30 years. And it stuck to its principles. The criticism was real, but the party was very small, about 4%. Even in the elections of 2009, it was doubtful that they will enter the parliament. Nevertheless, as the austerity started being imposed and the blame that we've heard before discussed was put on the shoulders of the Greek people, Syriza was quickly identified what was the correct source and the source of the blame. Quickly identified that it wasn't just the Greek people, it was a blame that should be shared, and particularly from those who, not only who borrowed with low interest rates, but also those who lent Greeks at very low interest rates and without any check and control. And so, if you wish, kept the Greek people energized against all the austerity measures and policies that the Troika was implementing in Greece. It gained traction particularly, I would have to say. And that was all despite the fear campaign that the previous government had launched against Syriza and everyone essentially who was criticizing Troika and the memoranda. And so despite that, there was a turning point, I think, after Thessaloniki, after the announcement of the program in Thessaloniki last October, where Syriza showed that it was ready to govern. It gave a program that was full, that was extended to every aspect of economic and social life. It gave solutions for the immediate solutions for the humanitarian crisis, and also it gave a price tag. So this program was fully developed and justified, and it actually showed that it could be implemented in the short term and the long term. And I think that's where the electorate picked up and gave Syriza the win that we saw last month.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're talking about the economic crisis in Greece and whether a new far-left government can strike a deal to keep it in the Eurozone and restart its failing economy. We're joined today from London by Maria Margaronis, Europe correspondent and contributing editor at The Nation. From New York by Natassa Romanou, a founder of the New York chapter of Syriza. And from Washington, D.C. by Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journal. Jacob Kirkegaard, you heard Natassa Romanou talking about Syriza's popularity. Now they're in power. Their prime minister and their finance minister have been meeting with European leaders here to discuss these previous agreements they've made with the so-called Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the IMF. In one of your papers, you analogize Greece's strategy to an old adage that if you owe the bank $1,000, it's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 billion, it's the bank's problem. Does Greece have some leverage here?
I think, unfortunately, the reality is that Greece does not have as much leverage as some of the new political leadership seems to think, because it is true that the euro area has lent about 240 billion or something to Greece. And that's a lot of money. But we should keep in mind still that this is about 2% of euro area GDP. And it is, for instance, only the amount that the ECB is going to be buying, government bonds in 4 months' time. So this is a lot of money, but compared to the rest of the euro area's economy, it's not that much money. And the main problem I have with this bank analogy is that this analogy assumes that if you default on the bank, that the debt just sort of goes away, and that's that there's nothing more to it. But the reality is that Greece's relationship with the bank or the euro area is much more intimate than a normal bank loan would assume. I mean, I like to compare it to the fact that if you had a large loan in a bank and everyone on your street worked at the bank and every one of the parents of your children in your children's school worked at the bank and all the people at your own job worked at the bank, would you still default on that loan? I don't think that's the case. And I think we should also recognize that as bad as the situation has been in the Greek economy since 2009, and today it has certainly become very near catastrophic, the reality is that, unfortunately, in my opinion, it can actually get a lot worse. If Greece defaults against the euro area, loses access to liquidity, has a bank run, etc., it's sort of like you have fallen from the 50th floor to the 40th floor in a building. There's still quite a lot further to fall, I'm afraid.
Maria Margaronis, I'd like to hear your response to that. And also, could you speak to why is it that Germany in particular, as well as some other European countries, are taking such a stiff line with Greece?
Okay, yes, I agree with Jacob that there is, unfortunately, could be further to fall. And also that Greece doesn't have very much economic leverage, but it does have political leverage. The political and geopolitical picture, in a way, cuts both ways. On the one hand, if one country leaves the Eurozone, that sets a precedent which is potentially very dangerous for the Eurozone. It also, I think, if Syriza were to fail in Greece, opens up the door to right-wing, anti-European, anti-austerity parties, which have been growing all over Europe. And in Greece, we have the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn, which is still the third party in parliament, in spite of the fact that most of its MPs are in prison awaiting trial. But we have anti-austerity right-wing parties growing in France and many other European countries. So in a way, having a pro-European anti-austerity party come to power is a potentially healing moment for the Eurozone, which is what Greece's new finance minister, Yannis Varoufakis, has been saying over and over again in his meetings with European leaders. Now, there is also, I think, for Germany, a different kind of fear of political contagion, which is that if Syriza succeeds, then we have the left-wing party Podemos rising in Spain, currently leading in the polls. We have a possible precedent for other countries that have been under tight austerity programs to say, well, hang on a minute, you're letting Greece off, what about us? And the German government also has to answer to its own voters. There's an important election in Hamburg on Sunday, the 15th of February, which I think may be partly why the Eurozone's decisions on Greece have been postponed until Monday, may have something to do with it. But it has to answer to its own voters who have been fed a diet of sort of anti-Greek propaganda, that it's the fault of the lazy Greeks who don't pay their taxes, who retire at 52, who don't work, etc. Whereas, in fact, if you look at statistics, Greeks are among the hardest workers in Europe, even though there is indeed a great deal of corruption and tax evasion and so on. So the German government has to be able to sell to its own voters some sort of compromise with Greece. And also the Syriza government has to be able to come back to Greece and say, look, we've got a deal. It isn't everything we wanted, but it is a deal. And I think that both of those things, to be an optimist for a moment, I think that both of those things are possible. I think that that Syriza's emphasis on wanting to stay in the Eurozone and wanting indeed to reform and change the Eurozone from within and make it work has been very important. I think its emphasis on cleaning up corruption, tackling the oligarchs in Greece has been extremely important, because you can't run a functioning economy under these conditions. And I also think that people in Greece will be very willing to accept a more partial solution. I mean, the thing everyone was saying to me in Greece before the election is, if Syriza does 2 or 3 of the 10 things they've promised, I'll be happy.
Natassa, I wanted to turn to you next. You heard Maria talking earlier about the perception of Syriza and of Greece elsewhere in Europe. I was speaking with a British journalist the other day. He said, look, Greece lived wildly beyond its means. It lied about the scale of its debts, both to itself and to its lenders. Now it's trying to cheat its way out of paying back the money it owes. I mean, what's your perception? How is there a way forward in that type of political climate within Europe?
Yes, I think that first of all, this type of these kinds of arguments that Greece cheated its way out of the all through these years is not entirely correct. As I said before, if you have a delinquent borrower, you have a delinquent lender, right? So it was a kind of it's a shared blame, and I would actually say that it was a blame that was mostly on the lender's part, and the rest of the European ruling elite in the center of the European Union, who actually put a lot of deregulations in the banks and the other financial institutions who were lending countries. Greece was not the only one who actually, let's say, misquoted the numbers in their budget books. There were other countries the same. It was known and understood, and there were a lot of players into that. It has been documented it has been documented in the media, so I don't need to go into much detail here. But I agree with Maria in what she is saying, that the popular sentiment is right now across Europe, not just in Greece, that something has to be done. We have to see somewhere a light at the end of the tunnel. And right now, the pro-austerity, let's say, parties are, or the pro-austerity narrative is not giving us this kind of light at the end of the tunnel. They are refusing to put a time frame within which economies will recover. So even if Greece gets out of the European Union, then something will have to be done with the debt of Spain and with the debt of Italy. So what will be the solutions then? So that's why I think it is important to put forward Syriza solutions, which is to find an overall solution for the entire European South, or all the countries which are actually suffering through that. And there is popular sentiment. We cannot discount that the growing numbers of anti-austerity policies in Southern Europe, not just in Spain and in Greece, in other countries as well, despite the fact that the governments in these countries are pro-austerity.
This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're talking about the economic crisis in Greece and whether a new far-left government can strike a deal to keep it in the Eurozone and restart its failing economy. We're joined today from London by Maria Margaronis, Europe correspondent and contributing editor at The Nation. From New York by Natassa Romanou, a founder of the New York chapter of Syriza. And from Washington, D.C., by Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues, and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, @GlobalJourn. Jacob Kirkegaard, Greece is in this face-off to a great extent with Germany over how this is going to go forward. And part of the discussion that the Greeks and others are advancing is they're saying, look, Germany got a big dose of debt forgiveness after World War II. In fact, many of the other European countries that took aid from the U.S. in the form of the Marshall Plan after World War II, many of those loans ultimately were forgiven. So why not help a neighbor now when they're down?
Well, I mean, I think that in many ways that actually is exactly what the euro area has been doing. I mean, they have, as I said earlier, lent Greece 240 billion euros, and they've done so at extremely concessional rates. The interest rates on these loans are very, very low. And the repayment period is actually only beginning sometime in the mid-2020s and currently goes out to the mid-2050s. So in net present value terms, the value of this debt has actually been reduced very substantially. And if you look at the total cost to the Greek government of servicing this total debt, even though it is at 175% of GDP, is very, very high, it's actually only about 2.5% of GDP. Which is a level that is lower than what the federal government here in the United States is paying for its debt and what many other euro area countries are paying for their debt. So I don't think it's true to say that the euro area is not giving Greece a helping hand. In my opinion, they most certainly are. And I think that they will continue to do so. And I would not be surprised if all of the debt that Greece currently owes to the IMF, to the ECB, and to the euro area would be converted into even longer dated debt so that it should probably only be repaid in 80 years from now, which would be, again, a very substantial reduction in the total value of the debt. So in many ways, I think Greece has been getting and will continue to get quite a lot of debt forgiveness from its neighbors in the euro area.
Natassa Romanou of Syriza, I wanted to ask you about something Jacob mentioned earlier, and he was talking about how if you think about being on a 50-story building, he said Greece has fallen from the 50th floor to the 40th floor, and that things could get much worse there if negotiations fail. How do you see that? I mean, isn't your new prime minister, isn't he risking quite a lot with his strategy in negotiating with Greece's creditors?
Yes, but he does, and that is why everybody is so concerned, and that's why everybody is watching very closely the developments. But you will have to consider what's the alternative that he has. We cannot let continue Greece into this path of destruction. I mean, the economy has shrunk by 25%, you said in your opening statements. There are people, 10% of the population is below poverty line. How are we going to be able to even make any payments, even if they are extended in any time of the future, if there is not now a realistic plan of the change of the debt restructuring or of the debt negotiation? And this is not something that Syriza is saying. IMF has admitted it itself, and the U.S. government and several senators are discussing that openly right now and putting pressure in Europe. So why is everybody admitting this? And it's just a core of countries in Central Europe who don't see that.
Maria Margaronis, what do you think the shape of some sort of final deal is going to look like? How is this going to be resolved? What are we going to be talking about a year from now, 2 years from now?
Well, I think if I had a crystal ball and I knew that, we would be, I would be very fortunate, and so would everybody else. We can't know at this point what's going to happen. I think and hope that there'll be some sort of solution. I think that, in fact, the Greek government has already dialed back on what it's been asking for. It's not asking for debt forgiveness. It's not asking for a haircut. It's asking to have the bonds restructured. It's asking to have repayments linked with growth. I mean, at the moment, only something like 11% of the money that's lent to Greece is going into the country itself. The other 89% is going to pay interest on the loans, which is a ludicrous situation for a crashed economy to be in. So it's asking to have repayments linked to growth. And Yanis Varoufakis, the finance minister, has in fact said that they're willing to accept 70% of the reforms mandated in the economic programme and wish to replace the other 30% with new reforms agreed in cooperation with the OECD. So, there's certainly ground for agreement. And I hope that Europe's politicians will see that this is really potentially a make or break moment for Europe itself. Now, if that doesn't happen, given what else is going on in the world, in the Ukraine, in the Middle East, in the general geopolitical instability as well as economic instability, I think we're in for very bumpy times, and not just in Greece.
Jacob Kirkegaard, with just about 30 seconds to go, how do you see any future deal taking shape, or do you see that things are going to end badly here?
No, I think there is a scope for a deal. I think the deal would incorporate the formal end of the Troika, meaning the IMF and the ECB will no longer be dealing with the Greek government. It will only be the euro area. I would expect all of the official sector debt to be converted into very, very long-dated euro area debt, maybe 80 years or, whatever the number is. And then I would expect the new Greek government to, at the end of the day, sign up to quite a lot of the structural reforms that were embodied in the existing Troika program, plus contributing many of its own priorities on tax evasion, oligarchs, and other things. So I think there is room for a deal.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalists, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Maria Margaronis, Natassa Romanou, and Jacob Kirkegaard. This week's producer is Taylor DeHaze, with assistance from Nassim Benchabani, Kara McLean, Sabrina Zhu, and Lucrezia Loza. Our technical director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.